Hello, everyone. Um, it's time for book two. First, I'd like to thank you all for checking out the last live reading I did. I've had a lot of views on it. I like knowing that you people are interested in what I've got to say. It kind of, in a way, makes it all worth it. Um, Order of the Trident Speculum, which will be book two in the series, is currently underway. As far as my part, I may have already said this, I'm pretty much done until stuff starts coming back, at which point I can format it and get it ready to go for its final printing. Um, Hopefully the cat won't be such an asshole this time. He's in the other room, the little one's in there playing video games, so maybe he will be a little bit more inclined to stay in there with her. Blog post launching tomorrow. It runs on Pacific time. So I think I've got it scheduled for 11 a.m. our time, so whatever that is, 2 hours, so maybe around 1 o'clock tomorrow it should go live. Anyway, I guess let's get down to it. Chapter 2, The Monsters Beneath. The sun shone down over a deep valley lined with trees along the rocky bluffs. The sounds of battle bounced off the jagged stone, echoing for miles. The choppy, torn dirt was littered with opposing armies, one black as night, while the other stood in stark contrast, holding against the other. The Dark Army was surrounded, choked into submission by the outnumbering forces around them. A deep crater laid open in the rock behind them as the dark creatures at its crest. "Hold the lines," the Dollar Eye commander shouted to his brethren, his sword drawn and ready to strike down the cursed foe. He parried a wide slash, thrusting his blade into the Druifar's throat. Stepping back, he withdrew from combat, assessing the situation. Thousands of Druifar stood defiantly against his armies. They were outmanned and outmaneuvered, with only one escape. He watched in amazement as the soldiers advanced into position, swallowing every inch of slack the enemy offered. He found it difficult to believe how easily they were bottlenecked, falling perfectly into his trap. But here they were, the last of their kind. Genocide felt wrong, but it was necessary. They were an abomination of his race, a mistake that should have never been offered sanctuary. He pitied them more than anything. It could have just as easily as been his men that fell to the corruption. Setting aside his personal feelings on the matter, he raised his long sword and readied his next command. Rolling the blade forward, he shouted across the battlefield, "Force these abominations back into the darkness from whence they sprang." The Druifar cursed and spit their altered tongue at their captors. They were losing ground, and quickly. It wouldn't be long before they would be crushed beneath the heel of their ancestors. Surrounded on all sides, they began to fall back, slowly escaping into the large hole in the earth. There they could regroup and claim victory with shadow games. Several thousand stood defiantly around the brim, awaiting their chance to follow without crushing those beneath them, or worse, falling into the depths from the chaos. They readied themselves. It wouldn't be long before the Dollar Eye would be upon them again. The Dollar Eye army shouted in unison, beginning their march forward. Choking against the surrounding resistance, they moved as one, flowing like a constricting wall, forcing the Druifar to abandon ground. The general marched behind the front line, following them toward victory. Commands flowed from him, keeping his men moving. If the front slowed, those behind would trample over them, unable to stop, forced from the rear. They raised their weapons, ready to swiftly deal with the shrinking army before them. The two met with a clash, littering the rocky terrain with a sea of blood. The explosion was great, sending several lines flying back on either side. Each man was replaced by the one behind him. Ducking a scimitar swipe, the Dollar Eye commander slashed him with his longsword. Spinning around, he parried another blow, raking the edge of the blade into another of the cursed beast. He dodged and ducked, using each action as preparation for the next, performing a dance of death that would have entranced any who paused long enough to watch. With the wide swipe, he thrust his free hand forward, blasting several of the black-skinned creatures back with an invisible force. They landed in piles, disappearing beneath their brethren swarming toward him. He worked his weapon, keeping them in arm's length. Glancing at the thousands of dead or dying Druafar before him, he quickly counted his own men. To his relief, their superior numbers and keen tactics resulted in fewer casualties, though he could tell his men were tired. They would need rest soon if they were to make the trek home. "Where the hell are the Alfar?" His question was answered by a familiar voice to his left. General, they've not been seen since our victory at Durnal Hill." The Dal'Rai behind him brought his sword up, deflecting an opposing strike. With ease, he brought a dagger up under the crude hide armor of the Druafar and split him open, disengaging him. Doing likewise, he backed away to relay orders to the captain. "Trindle, I'm glad to see you've made it. But why didn't the Druafar come with you?" "I don't know, my lord. They broke away when we left Durnal Hill. I haven't seen them since." "It would have been nice to know they weren't going to join us." "Aye, my lord." "The men are tired. We need to end this now. Take your men to the left flank. Send word to Resurus. I want his men to cover the right. We have to horseshoe them to close the distance. If we don't funnel them quickly enough, the plans fall to pieces." He jumped back, dodging another swipe from the Druafar. With a lightning-fast strike, he thrust his blade into his attacker's throat. When he spun to block another attack, the blade cut through, sending the Druafar's head into the air. Trindle nodded. With ease, he fell back, disappearing into the ranks. Fighting his way through the crowded battlements, he spotted the man he sought not far from the front line, locked in battle against one of the strange spider hybrids. Without pause, he charged, leaping into the fray. He drove his dagger deep into the creature's chest, feeling its loss of strength before he hit the ground. Picking himself up, he sheathed the blade and turned to face the younger Dal'Rai. Show off. You know you're lucky I saw you coming, otherwise I might have mistaken you for one of these bastards." He chuckled at the man's response. "You'd need your eyes checked if you mistook me for one so ugly." With a cunning smile, he continued, "Resurus, Cassian asked you to gather your men and take the right flank. We have to end this quickly. Blow your horn when you're in position. Don't advance until you hear mine. We'll have to move as one and quickly close on them." Accepting the call to duty, Resurus snapped to attention, regarding his friend as well as his ranking superior. "Aye, Captain." With a salute, he turned and shouted orders to his unit. Cassian felt beads of sweat and blood run down his face. The afternoon sun was blistering hot in the thick leather, but it was better than the scars he'd suffer were he not wearing it. His slightly pointed ears twitched with the familiar sound to his right. A moment later, a similar tone echoed to the left. His men were in position and moving forward. He paused, catching a glimpse through the rows of soldiers. "Maius?" The soldiers moved, blocking his view. The familiar profile was gone. Shaking his head clear, he returned to his task. Forcing a smile, he channeled his energy through the sword, letting the athame do all the work. The metal began to glow red. Within moments, it was so bright he found it hard to look at. Slashing the magical blade cut through his enemy with ease, charring their flesh before it even connected. Clothing and armor were no match, bursting into flames with the slightest touch. Even the occasional metal armor became useless against it, melting and searing its wearer. "Keep him moving," he shouted, clearing the path in front of him. With a final charge, he thrust his sword into the air, firing a bright flash of red over the battle. It burst overhead, showering the area in a deep red glow. He set his feet, hearing the army move into position around him. They roared with synchronized footsteps, quickly gaining ground against the unsuspecting Druafar. The gap closed quicker than ever, with no leadership to oppose the advance. Within seconds, they engulfed the encircling foe. The rear of the Druafar army began to disappear, leaving a few thousand to stop the progression. Like a plow forcing snow over the parapets, his men surged forward. More and more of the enemy fell into darkness, their strength dissolved with each passing moment. Cassian watched the last few take the plunge, disappearing into the earth. Cautiously, he stepped forward, peering down into the hole. If they had any idea as to his plans, their faces, blurred by the distance, didn't show it. Beneath him, hundreds of thousands climbed inside against the rocky slopes, forcing the others to retreat deeper into the catacombs or be crushed beneath their weight. The walls were too steep to climb with any speed, not that escape was possible anyway. Shaking his head, feeling his pity return, he stabbed his sword into the churned dirt and rock, leaving it to rest in the ground beside him. They scurried in the darkness like a hive of angry ants clawing to escape the flood that was about to wash over them. Without a word, he flipped the buckle of his belt pouch and pulled a tightly wrapped scroll. Breaking the red wax seal pressed into the seam, he unrolled it and uttered the words etched into the page. By the power of your ancestors, you are condemned to darkness for the rest of eternity. Should you resurface, the light from the sun will char you to a crisp. The words were little more than notice of their fate. Executing this plan, he extended his hands, letting the scroll float slowly into the pit below. A bright light formed above the hole, stretching to its edges. It shifted into a wide disk and completely covered the entrance. Several beams of blinding light shot forth, illuminating the thousands below. Screaming bellows out as they pressed deeper into the cavern in hopes of evading the burning light. Watching the last Druafar disappear from sight, he turned, spotting a fearsome sight lining the cliff tops. Legions of Alfar stood along the ridge behind his men. It didn't take a military genius to realize they were in ambush position. Thousands of bows were drawn and aimed, ready to bring an end to his men. A familiar celestial voice caressed his ears. Give me 1 second, people. All right. Lord Cassian, by order of Emperor Julian III, you and your kind have been pronounced human and are hereby stricken from our history. Your race is responsible for the foul abominations that have torn this world asunder, and you must now pay for your crimes. We cannot allow your kind to flourish in fear of this nor another incident happening again. Waving his hand forward, he gave the signal. Fire! Cassian watched tens of thousands of arrows release, flying high into the sky, ready to end the majority of his men in one fell swoop. For the briefest of moments, he felt the burning sun leave his skin, replaced by the shadow of death. The wooden shafts rained down, plummeting into the army of unsuspecting Dalarai. He felt a violent thrust against his side, knocking him from his feet and covering him completely. Several sharp pains stabbed into him, but none felt deep enough to be life-threatening. Pushing the form off of him, realization set in. Why was I the one spared? Pain and confusion filled him. Looking into Trindle's blood-soaked face, he saw too many arrows protruding from his friend's body. A steady stream of fresh blood ran from his pelling skin. General, Trindle said with his dying breath, get home. He felt a pain deeper than the arrows had plunged. Stealing a glance around, his army was no more, riddled with the wooden shafts. A few crawled from the massacre, Osiris unable to claim them with the number of souls received, but they wouldn't live much longer. The ground shook with the massive Alfaran army breaking their halt. Drawing their battle glaives, they marched down the steep paths and into the valley floor. It wouldn't take much to end the few survivors in a final assault. Cassian felt the ground shake with the numbers advancing toward him. Crawling from the pile of bodies, he took in each of their faces, unsure how he would avenge his men. He knew if they reached him, it wouldn't be long before he joined his men in death. The Alfaran commander scanned the extermination. He felt a pang of guilt for his betrayal, but his emperor had made his task very clear. To disobey would be considered treason. But what was the price for his betrayal? The majority of the Dalarai were already dead. The rest would be very soon, from blood loss or the keen blades of his soldiers. Searching the valley, he caught a familiar figure where Cassian had been standing. The Dalarai general crawled to his feet, knowing a second volley of arrows would result in his death. Hoping the Alfar would rush him with their blades, he spotted their commander watching from the cliff tops. If the traitor was going to pay, he'd have to taunt him into action. Kilneas, you've attempted genocide and murdered my men in cold blood. For what? So your petty emperor can save face? You and I fought side by side against the Drew. I saved your life time and time again, and this is how you repay me? With the blood of my men? Your emperor is a coward and unworthy of the blood we share. You have or have you forgotten that my people created yours as well? I will not stand for this. Mark my words, your emperor will regret this day. Kilneas drew his thin blade and stormed towards the wounded general. Reaching the edge of the carnage, he shouted over the dead, I regret having to give that order, but it comes from my emperor. I will not disobey. A smile crept to Cassian's face. He was a superior swordsman, provided he hadn't lost too much blood from the few arrow wounds. So be it. Your death will be as merciless as the one you offered my men. The two generals charged in, their swords glimmering in the sunlight. Kilneas ducked a swing, slicing low, hoping to wound the Dalarai general. Cassian lifted his leg, avoiding the blow, bringing his pommel down on the Alfaran commander's back. He shoved, throwing him off. Kilneas quickly recovered, spinning to guard against another attack. He swung hard, hoping to catch the Dalarai off guard. Cassian watched the Alfaran general summon the strength for a powerful strike. Bracing himself, he readied to parry the blow. Using both hands, he slowed the attack, sending it wide. Recovering, he spun around and drove his sword deep into Kilneas' shoulder. The wound wasn't fatal, but it would limit the use of his arm. Kilneas felt the blade penetrate deep, and his arm went numb. Realizing the tendons were severed, he focused his efforts with his right arm. Picking up the pace, his Alfaran sword danced with remarkable speed. Cassian was having trouble keeping up with the speed of the lighter weapon. He gave up predicting attacks, instead relying strictly on the movement of his opponent's shoulder. Fear began to creep into him with the increasing speed. He had to do something quick or it would all be over. His own speed wasn't able to keep up. The arrows must have robbed him of more strength than he'd realized. With no other option, he lunged forward, forcing the Alfaran commander to readjust. Kilneas took a step back, regaining his balance. His rhythm was ruined. Forcing him to slow again, he swung, hoping to reclaim his speed, but it was broken. Cassian felt a bit of relief seeing the general take the bait. He easily deflected the next few strikes, sending each one wider until he saw his opening. With a quick jab, he plunged the tip of his sword into the chest of his Alfaran foe. Without giving him time to react, he retracted the blade and spun around, letting his momentum carry the deadly edge. The long sword cut deeply into Kilneas' neck. The Alfaran commander spun from the force, feeling the gaping gash in his throat. He felt cold. Raising his hand to inspect the wound, he felt the thick blood pour from him. Eyes wide, he looked over his men before falling into the already blood-soaked, body and arrow-ridden earth. Remorse shot through Cassian, but there was little choice. The fact was, had he not killed the man he'd fought beside for so long, he wouldn't be able to warn his people. The encircling Hydrophar rushed in, like an army of ants to a bowl of sugar. Within moments, he was completely surrounded, trapped within impenetrable walls. They held their glaives at the ready, poised to avenge their commander. Cassian glanced at the keen edges, ready to end them. He smiled and sheathed his sword. Taking a deep breath, he prepared himself. Such is life. The front line swung, aiming to cut the Dalarai general down. He felt, as he felt the first blade contact his skin, an orange glow engulfed him. The Dalarai stared in confusion, searching the empty space between their solid walls. Cassian materialized on the Arcanum. Its glass floor and high-vaulted ceiling made it larger than it really was. The room was illuminated with hundreds of floating candles, aimlessly hovering in the air out of reach. Stepping from the suspended floor, he made his way into the elegant corridors of Draenor. His heavy footsteps echoed on the polished marble, leaving dusty tracks behind him. He could feel the trickle of blood from the Alfaran glaive running down his cheek. Ignoring the minor wound, he rounded the corner and stepped into the grand hall. The room was covered with ancient runes carved into the walls and ceilings. Even though a city of the mortal plane, the gods were known to frequent the ancient settlement. He took in the tales depicted in the runes, recalling the hundreds of times he'd heard stories in his childhood. Several columns stood on each side, supporting the cloudy vaulted ceiling. Hundreds of sconces hovered overhead, each one positioned perfectly between the others, illuminating the massive room. He glanced at the throne, spotting the oldest of his kind resting in the black, elegant robes. Without delay, he marched along the line of running the length of the room, stopping a few feet from the dais. Dropping to a knee, he locked eyes on the crimson carpet beneath his feet, addressing the eldest Dalarai formally. My lord, the Alfar have turned against us. My army has been demolished, and they've declared us human. I fear we're to be hunted until the last of our kind are exterminated. The ancient Dalarai king motioned his grandson to stand. My boy, you are young. Your emotions get the better of you. Our people will have difficult days to come, that's a certainty, but this is hardly the first time this world has lost its need of us. Worry not. We'll be restored when our kind is nothing more than a distant memory. On that day we'll be reborn, and Draenor will once again be filled with Dalarai. The king held a contentful smile, reassuring the young prince. Cassian looked into the eyes of his grandfather. May that day come swiftly, for I do not know how we will last. And that is the end of chapter 2. Maybe one of these days I'll get the hang of it, and we'll be able to, I don't know, read it without messing up. But anyway, that's all I've got for now. I'm aiming to do this every week, so I think I'm going to make it a regular Sunday thing. We'll pick up chapter 3 next week. Again, Mondays I usually do my blog post. Other than that, just pay attention to what's on Facebook and Twitter and all that stuff. Usually it's the same thing no matter which one you hit.